today that is the assignment. We ended last time with the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, which is the non-Synoptic Gospel, and I had time to say just a couple of things about it, and to start looking at the one text in it with you, which is chapter 8, verses 56 to 59, that triumphant troping against, as I would call it, of it's actually the Elohistic revisal of the Yahweh, or as John would have thought, against Moses as the author of Torah. We won't shut the door until about 4, so that will make it a little warmer in here. And I remind you of what that passage, I'm looking at the wrong place. I remind you of that passage again. This is chapter 8, and the crucial exchange, starting with verse 56, is the St. John chapter 8. Jesus speaking to the Pharisees, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad." I'm reading from the King James or Authorized Version. "Then said the Jews unto him," obviously with great skepticism, "Thou art not yet 50 years old," he is of course 33, "and hast thou seen Abraham?" Jesus said unto them, "Verily, verily, I say unto you," in what clearly strikes them as a blasphemy. It's the Eya, Asha, Eya formula, but turned about. Before Abraham was, I am, and as we ran out of the room last time, I said that in some sense also means before Moses was, I am, and also means, and we'll see that working in the first chapter of John in a moment, because I want us to turn to that text. It also means, as I said, that this putative John, we do not know who the author of the Gospel of John is, but I will talk a little bit about that background in a moment. Is also saying that as a writer, before Moses was, or as you and I would say, before J, or his Elohistic redactor, or his priestly redactor, or before the Deuteronomist was, I am. All the contrast involved between was and am. So I want us, before we come full circle to that, and I will try to get us full circle to that at about 5:15. Jerry, I made an appeal last night.
There's going to be somebody who said he would come up.
There's only this, but it is not doing the young any good. It is only...
Maybe as time goes by,
all right. Let's look at the beginning of the Gospel of John together, at what is certainly its most famous passage. I will not take the time to read all of it aloud, but I will give you, my dear, you can bear that direct heat, by all means. I will read the crucial part of it. It is the very famous, and remember this is somebody writing in Koine, but thinking in Aramaic, and somebody who knows what the Hebrew involved is, which is not that far away from the Aramaic. That is to say, the word logos here is the word davar. In the beginning was the word. Interesting, of course, since the Hebrew word davar does not mean what the Greek logos does. It does not just mean a word or a thought or a concept or a formulation. It is not to be distinguished from an act. It is not to be distinguished from in a deep sense, a person or a thing. It is simultaneous with word, act, and thing or person. And I think that multiple play is involved here. And obviously the deep parody, the serious parody, here at the opening of the Gospel of John, is of the priestly Genesis. It is of the famous triumphant hymn of the return from Babylon, which now constitutes the first chapter of Genesis, the shining forth of the light into the darkness and the movement over the face of the deep. Beautifully revised, I must say, more beautifully revised than any of the Gnostic Gospels, with the single exception of the one that we'll spend most on today. Extraordinarily beautiful work, undoubtedly by Valentine, as I'm convinced, called the Gospel of Truth. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him. Without Him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and already in the allegory you have clearly reached a very bitter moment, and I'll talk about the background of that in a moment, because the light shining in darkness is most certainly Jesus shining among the Jews 2.5 generations before this was written, and the darkness that comprehended it not are those Pharisees of the 8th chapter that we've just looked at. Then you pass into the story of John the Baptist, but before departing from this chapter, I want us to look very carefully at the 17th and 18th verses, which link up, I think, quite deliberately to that passage at the end of chapter 8 before Abraham was, I am. For the law was given by Moses. This writer is not disputing it, that is to say, and Moses, of course, is understood as being the writer. It is what we would now call the J writer and his revisionist. But grace and truth came by Jesus Christ, and he is playing upon the fact that the aletheia in his Koine Greek is distinct from the Logos, and the chorus of the grace is also distinct, but davar, insofar as it is a true word, will include all three. And there is a strange and almost, I would not say wicked, but there certainly is a polemical play there, which we usually miss. And then the insistence, which also will take one to, and have you seen Abraham? No man hath seen God at any time, which is of course not true, according to the J writer. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. I want us today to be discussing texts, and particularly Gnostic texts, I want to get a few things clear about this, and in this I am following not any of my own eccentricities. When I come to those today, or at any time, I will point them out. But the received scholarship of the most recent and authoritative kind. This is, of course, the non-synoptic gospel. It is written very late. The earliest possible date for it is the year 100 of the Common Era, or 100 AD, Anno Domini in Christian terms. Probably even later than that. It might be about 120. You are on the coast of Asia Minor, possibly somewhere between Antioch and Edessa, though we're not even sure of that. You have a Jewish writer writing Koine, but able to read Hebrew, and whose normal language, like most of the writers of what we call the New Testament, is Aramaic. So he speaks Koine, or Papilistic Greek, as a second tongue. And you can tell this because the peculiarities of a Hebrew or Aramaic syntax, on top of which is superimposed an overlay of a demonic Greek diction, absolutely obvious if you know the two languages. What is more crucial is that he is in a much more embattled situation than the writer of the first three Gospels. They, all of them, like the Pauline texts, were written down to, we believe, no more than a generation after, or at most a generation and a half after, the historical crucifixion. You will notice, any of you who are readers of St. Paul, and you've all read him at one time or another, and also certainly of two of the three Gospels, Luke is by no means certain, there is a definite feeling of imminent parousia. There is a feeling that Jesus will come again in their lifetimes. There is therefore an apocalyptic expectation which governs everything. It is perfectly clear from the beginning to the end of the Gospel of John, first, that it being now something like 90 years or so, probably after the crucifixion, 3 generations after the generation of Jesus, at least 2 generations, or at most a generation and a half after the generation of Paul and the other apostles, there has been an enormous despair, an enormous sense of embattlement, an enormous waning of apocalyptic hope. In the year 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple and ended the political independence of Judea, which was revived briefly and fiercely in the rebellion of Eva and Bar Kokhba about the year 135. One of the consequences of what happened in 70 AD, and we know this for a fact, we have it in Josephus, we have it in both Jewish and Christian writings, is that since the Jewish Christians, who until then had been, as it were, a tolerated sect, would not fight against the Romans, not associate themselves with the nationalistic revolt, they were thrown out. They were excommunicated. According to contemporary historians, that kind of excommunication or expulsion of the Jewish Christians from the Jewish communities did not really reach the upper coast of Asia Minor, where the Gospel of John comes from, until somewhere after 100 AD or into the Common Era. And that's undoubtedly, as most recent scholars say, and I think they are quite right, that is the literary climate of the Gospel according to St. John. It's bitter, it's embattled, it's written by the leader of a small sect or grouping of Jewish Christians who have recently been tossed out completely by the other Jews. It is not only the most anti-Jewish, but in modern terms, it is fair to say the most anti-Semitic, and I don't wish to arouse passions one way or the other, but it is an anti-Jewish text, and there are real problems in it, as recent papal pronouncements occasionally are willing to acknowledge, particularly in the time of John, less so in the church as it is at this moment. But, yes?
What is the reason of the expulsion?
Reason of the expulsion?
Of the sect?
Oh, the Jewish Christians refused to take part in the Zealot rebellion. They refused to take part in the defense of Jerusalem. They refused to fight in various Jewish legions that were put together against Vespasian and Titus. Not presumably for lack of nationalistic feelings, but because in that stage of their belief, they were for total peace. It undoubtedly caused enormous bitterness on both sides. It's a bitterness which is still being reflected evidently a full generation later. If this is, as it must be, 35 or so years on from the destruction of Jerusalem, the bitterness of the belated casting out of this small community seems to be echoing. And I want to make some observations which I haven't seen made by Christian scholars, but which are, I think, the background of chapter 8, and of a Jesus who, unlike the Jesus of the Synoptic Gospels, the Jesus of Mark, of Matthew, the Jesus of Luke, would never say, before Abraham was, I am. Indeed, he doesn't go around saying, I am, but he keeps saying, I am, right through the text of St. John. He is very concerned, the Jesus of this gospel, with his dignity and his rank and his place in the hierarchy in a purely Jewish context and the context of the history of what you can call Jewish religion or Jewish culture or Jewish writing. And indeed, this is beyond a question from a literary point of view, as well as an existential, you might say, point of view, the most anxiety-ridden of the four Gospels. Indeed, more even than the Apocalypse of John, which is technically an apocalyptic work, which is a very weird piece of work indeed, and full of terrible hatreds against both Jews and Romans, but particularly Romans, reflecting a somewhat later time and a somewhat later place, but probably some people who might have been children in this particular Jewish Christian congregation. One of them grew up, probably wrote that work. It cannot be the same man. It is dated at least a generation further on from that, though in the same grouping. Therefore, one speaks of the Johannine writings. In any case, that is the atmosphere that one is dealing with here in the first chapter and also in the 8th chapter and indeed throughout the work. You have literary anxiety, you have existential anxiety, you have an anxiety of having been expelled by the other Jews. You have what is, I think, beyond a question, more even than St. Paul, really eloquent writing. In terms of the Koine original, the only text, and at this point I can only give a literary judgment, but it isn't completely counter to what a number of others would be saying. The strongest text, as I would put it, aesthetically speaking, the most interesting text, the most polemical text, but also the most consistently eloquent and inventive text in the whole of the New Testament is the Gospel, according to St. John. And then we have another problem, and this is what I want to come on to immediately, and shortly I will stop lecturing and take us directly into a Gnostic contrast. This was probably, in its original form, which we do not have, a much more Gnostic text than it is now. Certain scholars have demonstrated, to my satisfaction, that in the most famous verse, and most important verse of the first chapter, and perhaps of the whole book, verse 14, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, where the current Koine or original text has the word sarkis, meaning flesh of a human being. The original text undoubtedly read, and the word was made pneuma, P-N-E-U-M-A, spirit or breath, spiritus, and dwelt among us. Because the incarnation, which has always been a scandal for negative theology of all kinds in the history of Christianity, was an absolute scandal for Gnosticism. The one thing that all Gnostics agreed on, whether they called themselves Christian Gnostics or not, was that no Savior could possibly be incarnated in a mere body, and let alone then suffer on the cross in a mere body. And the one place in the least interesting of these four Gnostic texts I asked you to read today in the Nag Hammadi volume. Those of you who don't have a copy of the Nag Hammadi, whether you look on with somebody else, I'd like to look at a passage on page 332. It claims this in the not very remarkable treatise called the Second Treatise of the Great Sect. Here is a denial on the part of the Great Seth, which is the Gnostic name for Jesus himself. Seth being, as you may remember, even in J, the replacement for Abel and Cain, the firstborn of Adam and Eve, who replaces the two sons doing it in their different ways. The middle of page 332, a pure Gnostic passage. Those who were there punished me, but I was not afflicted at all, and I did not die in reality, pure Gnosis, but in appearance, lest I be put to shame by them, because these are my kinsfolk, meaning, of course, the Jews. I removed the shame from me, and I did not become faint-hearted in the face of what happened to me at their hands. I was about to succumb to fear, and I suffered according to their sight and thought, in order that they may never find any word to speak about them. For my death, which they think happened only to them. Typical Gnostic antithetical twist. In their error and blindness, since they nailed their man unto their death, they did not nail me. For their ennoyas, meaning their thought forms or their indwelling minds, did not see me, for they were deaf and blind. But in doing these things they condemned themselves. Yes, they saw me, they punished me. It was another, their father, meaning the Satana figure, the Strmel figure, and that follows directly, of course, from the rhetoric of Satan is your father, which is exchanged in that angry interchange in chapter 8 in the temple between Jesus and the Pharisees. There's no similar place in the other three in the Synoptic Gospel where Jesus says to the Jews that you are descended from Satan. It was not I. They struck me with the reed. It was another Simon. That is Simon the Cyrene. Simon the thief, the satanic figure who bore the cross on his shoulder. Their eyes were so blinded that they crucified even the wrong appearance. It was another upon whom they placed the crown of thorns. And while this was going on, and you get this unforgettable and rather terrifying vision of a laughing Savior, a laughing Jesus, who is laughing in derision at this absurd error. Certainly from a literary point of view, a uncanny couple of sentences, but I was rejoicing in the height over all the wealth of the archons. The archons are always the rulers of the darkness of this world, and the offspring of their era, of their empty glory, and I was laughing at their ignorance, at their lack of gnosis or knowledge. A very striking passage, wholly consonant with the notion that there are certainly strong Gnostic elements in the Gospel of John. But I want now to divert us and to talk about something a little more complicated, especially since this is the last of our 5 religious seminars. We're going to go on to 5 Freudian seminars, and then 4, or I hope even 5, seminars on poetry. And the transition is by way of Freud at his most spookily religious, I would say, the amazing mingling of 2 things that he originally writes in January 1912, Totem and Taboo, and the 3 essays on the transference. I have all the information there on the board. That is the assignment for next time. I remind you again, we meet at our regular 4 o'clock time. I also urge those of you who have not been coming to see me out of shyness, that I will be available that day as almost every Monday from 2:30 on in room 236 to talk to you about essays. And if you find that you're never going to get there, then we'll try to work out some other time, or I may even ask you when the spring weather is better to come up to be able to talk to me. In any case, that is the assignment. We are going on to Freud, but I want to talk about this whole question of a Gnosticism. Not that Freud is a Gnostic, but that in his very complicated attitude towards religion, he does and says things that in some ways would be more appropriate if both Judaism and Christianity were varieties of Gnosticism than the normative disciplines that they actually are. But let me talk a little bit about Gnosis, and let me begin with a formula which is not mine. In no more than 5 minutes, I will take us into the text of the Gospel of Truth. There is an ancient formula. In fact, it is cited by the distinguished Hans Jonas, whose book on the Gnostic religion I would commend to you as still the best thing available in any language on the subject, and he was, of course, one of the really distinguished teachers at this institution, now unfortunately retired because he is in old age. The formula which he repeats is that failed prophecy becomes apocalyptic, failed apocalyptic becomes Gnosticism. Let me repeat that. Failed prophecy becomes apocalyptic, failed apocalyptic becomes Gnosticism. I was talking last night to a very bright young man named Bentley Layton, who was retranslating all of these Nag Hammadi texts, because they are mostly very badly translated here, who strikes me as the real successor to Jonas among Gnostic scholars. And we had a very strange conversation, because we are going to come upon that figure called Barbello, B-A-R-B-E-L-O, which is one of the names of the Enoya or the Shekinah, as she would have been called in Orthodox Hebrew terms, the indwelling presence of God, the Chokmah or Sophia or wisdom figure, whose casting out in some strange narcissistic reverie is the beginning, as we will see, of every Gnostic cosmogony whatsoever. And I was saying I had never understood the name and attributed it to my lack of Gnostic, because I am not Gnostic Coptic, since I do not know Coptic, and he is now the world's authority on Coptic. And he said to my astonishment that he had pretty much worked out to his satisfaction, this excited me a great deal, that Barbello actually came from, as a name, a Coptic word meaning a pot boiling over, which fascinated me, because what I reminded him of, and it fascinated us both, because I think together we've uncovered something, is the strange meaning of the word apocalypse. Because apocalypse is translated in Latin as revelation, meaning in effect the taking aside of a veil or a covering, one forgets what a homely word it is in the original Greek. It means taking the lid off the pot so that the pot will not boil over. It becomes therefore a very fascinating trope for the relationship between what is called apocalyptic and what is called Gnosticism. And let me be very clear what that original definition meant. Prophecy is, of course, that Hebraic mode, highly normative, which involves a foundation on the Torah and an insistence that historical justice can come in time. It does not call for an end in time. It calls for the coming of the Messiah or similar figures within time. It does not despair of history, no matter how bad history gets to be. It is alien to the spirit of normative Judaism to despair of history. It is not permitted because history belongs to Yahweh. No matter what is happening to you, ultimately it does, after all, belong to Yahweh. But it is absolutely true that after 70 AD, those who had the prophetic temperament increased, that is to say, the fall of Jerusalem, increasingly turned to apocalyptic. And apocalyptic, from the book of Enoch on, is that mode in which an end of the world is called for, and a despair of time, and a despair of history, and a despair of the very foundations of the earth takes place. But apocalyptic is still more hopeful than Gnosticism, because apocalyptic still holds the doctrine that this creation, whatever has happened to it, really was good, and that the God of history, who is now being called upon to bring history and the earth to an end, is the good and true God, Yahweh, and he is efficacious even if he has been hiding himself. But Gnosticism is from the beginning, and nobody knows for sure what its beginnings are. and I don't want to take too much time for talking about its origins or its supposed origins here. It may have been purely pagan in its beginnings, in the Hermetic writings, Greek, Hellenistic, Alexandria, as early perhaps as the 2nd century before Christ. It may have been Jewish from the beginning, as Gershom Scholem always insisted, but perhaps on the basis of insufficient evidence, and it may indeed have spread among the Jews ferociously after the fall of Jerusalem, and there may have been a Hellenistic, Alexandrian Gnosticism, which led to certain strains in Philo that we can't otherwise quite account for. Or it may have been Persian. It may have had a great deal to do with the Manichaean dualism, but it has the following characteristics which are absolute and which distinguish it even from apocalyptic. It starts with the notion, which any reader of Blake in English literature is very familiar with, that the creation and the fall, both of the universe and of human beings, is one and the same event. A single passage in the J-Rite, and we will see this several times today, that Gnostic writers cannot stand, is Yahweh's taking the red earth, molding the Adama together, breathing on it, and fashioning or modeling on it the image of a person, and then making that into a living being. That is the second and false Adam, as far as Gnosticism is concerned, and the being doing that is never Yahweh, but is a figure called the Aldabah, or sometimes Saklos, or sometimes even Samal. He is not the true God, he is the false God, or the demiurge. There's obviously a deep dualism, totally antithetical to the spirit of normative Judaism, at least somewhat antithetical to the spirit of normative Christianity, though not probably to the spirit of the gospel, according to St. John, in all of this. That is to say, Gnosticism starts with a very radical and peculiar notion, that degradation or the fall takes place within the divinity itself, so that every act recorded on the part of that being, every act which disturbs an original abyss, only the original abyss is called the forefather and the foremother, and only the original abyss, ironically enough, that tohu and bohu, that waste and darkness, which are deprecated by the priestly author, that, according to the Gnostics, is the true goodness, is the true creation before it was flawed, is the true mother and the true father, and they call it both forefather and foremother. A demiurge, called by various names, but identified by them with the Hebraic Yahweh, fell away from that, saw his reflection in the water. We'll look at certain passages about this in a moment, and the terrible narcissistic reverie started to fashion a false creation. In doing so, his wisdom figure, or wife, or consort, the Hebrew Shekinah, now become, or Chokmah, or wisdom, now become various names, including Sophia and Barbello, falls away also, and also formulates a kind of false creation in the abyss. It is a weird and powerful story. It's a story about secondariness taking the place of primary matters. It's a story which insists that the ultimate flaw is in the Godhead itself and not in us, and it has several extraordinary consequences, and one I must talk about immediately because I want to take us directly into the gospel of truth. The crucial one is this, and this is recognizable from an aspect of Blake, and as we'll see later this semester in American form, an aspect of Emerson. There is a primal Adam in every one of us, male or female, according to the Valentinian Gnostics in particular. There is an or form. There is what is best and oldest in ourselves, and it is no part of the creation. It is part of the original abyss. It is no part of the creation fall. It is superior to Yahweh. It is superior to all of his angels. It is superior to the patriarchs. It hears the call in Christian Gnosticism of the Redeemer, sometimes called Jesus, sometimes called Seth. It is capable of responding to that call. It is capable of finding its way back to the original unity, always called the pleroma, or wholeness. It is, in short, whether it knows it or not one of the archons, one of the devils or bad angels who are ruling over us, though they bear the names of the book of Enoch's righteous angels, because that too is being reversed here. It is one of what is called the Aeons, A-E-O-N-S, which in their entirety are called the all the entirety. We will see that very shortly in the Gospel of Truth. Now, that is likely to sound, I know, confusing. It is a doctrine which is radically dualistic. It is at the same time a doctrine whose psychological associations are extraordinary. I don't wish to offend any close reader or follower of Lacan in this room, and I am not myself, in my opinion, anti-Lacanian, though I have many reservations. But I read Lacan's relationship to Freud as being a kind of Gnostic relationship, because if you begin an account of the genesis of the individual psyche with what is called the mirror stage, then you are, and Lacan, who was well aware of this, he was aware of everything. He was a shrewd and learned person in these matters, and indeed his work is chock full of these explicit references to his Gnostic affinities. He is, I think, quite deliberately following the Gnostic cosmogonies in his formulation of the mirror phase and in assigning it priority. That is to say, in insisting that it is in a moment of Gnosticistic reverie that trembling version of the self is born. But I want us to turn to this very beautiful text, though not, alas, well translated here, the Gospel of Truth, and I'd like us to work through various portions of it, particularly at the beginning, fairly closely together, but leaving enough time to look at the versions of Genesis that one finds both in the book called the Hypostasis or Reality of the Archons and the Secret Book of John, which are the principal Gnostic texts that have survived besides this, but this is the only one that seems to me to have real literary power. Valentinus was certainly a 2nd century Alexandrian who may have been Jewish descent. We are not sure. He certainly did become a Catholic Christian. He went to Rome, where indeed for a while he was a candidate for the Bishop of Rome. He left the church at Rome and started what became the major heresy of the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, known as the Valentinian in all of its form, and to this day the crucial mode, really, of Gnostic speculation, because he rejected the sacraments. In a sermon made before the Bishop of Rome, parts of which we have, he said that a perfect cognition, a perfect gnosis, the word he would have used, and whether that should be translated knowledge or acquaintance with in English, I am not sure, but a perfect acquaintance with the truth was more than enough to free every one of us and bring ourselves back to the pleroma or the all, or to what was best and oldest in us. We did not need the sacraments. He then wrote a gospel referred to by various, most of what we knew about the Gnostics until the material making up this volume was found, and I want to talk about how it was found a little later on, because there's something very fascinating about this. In fact, let me leap ahead to this, because I don't want to miss this, and it is a trope that will come up both in our reading of the American poets later on, but because Freud himself is so interested in catastrophe creation, as we will see, is a trope that will come up in talking about Freud also. The place that I used to know Gnosticism best was where it had been explored most powerfully by Gershon Scholem, and it's a form that all of you know it in to one degree or another. The Hasidism, which is still around us, both of the Lubavitcher and Satmara variety, is and I know we should have stones thrown at me, technically decadent version of the Lurianic Kabbalah, which is a 16th century, originally Sephardic, Jewish mode of speculation. It rose on the ruins of the earlier Kabbalah in order to meet the crisis of the expulsion of the Jews from Iberia. Luriel, who was a most extraordinary genius, who, so far as we can see, put down on paper nothing but a few poems, taught his disciples the extraordinary doctrine of what he called the Shavera HaKelim, the breaking apart of the vessels, or indeed of the jars, because they are indeed household jars that he is thinking of. And of course that image of the breaking of the jars startlingly occurs here in the Gospel of Truth. And again last night in conversation with Bentley Layton, I suddenly came to a realization of what must be involved in this. The actual text that you are reading, the Gospel of Truth, or the other text that you have read, were of course found preserved in jars. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found preserved in jars. It was an ancient tradition, first based among the Jews, and then it spread among the Christians and among the Gnostics, that if you wish to consume a text, you threw it in fire. But if you wish to preserve it, you put it into the jars. So far as I can tell, when Valentinus uses the image of those jars which are full and those which are empty, those which break apart and those which are preserved, which in some way that Sholem and nobody else could ever have as yet worked out, does lead eventually to the great trope of the breaking apart of the Kalim and then their consequent restitution, tikkun, as it is called in the Hebrew of Loria. I suddenly see, on the basis of this, that he means jars full of text. He means indeed words which are light. And that has a great deal to do with some of the extraordinary passages that we are about to look at. Now this is not, I think, well translated. MacRae is a good scholar, but doesn't write a good English. I went over the text last night with Bentley Lake, who was turning out a Doubleday volume, retranslating all of these texts, and I'm going to cite his version as one goes. But I want to work through one paragraph very carefully, and it's the second one, but look at the first with me to begin with, because I think you get some sense of what Gnosticism actually is. You need to take an authentic text, and this is a very beautiful one. Now this undoubtedly was originally written in Greek, because Valentinus was, whether Jewish or not, all the Jews and all the Gentiles of Alexandria in the 2nd century spoke and wrote in Greek. Philo, for instance, knew no Hebrew. He wrote in Greek. Whether you were Neoplatonist, whether you were therefore pagan, whether you were Christian, whether you were Jewish, in Alexandria in the 2nd century, you wrote in Greece. But later, as Greek tended to be lost as a tongue, Middle Egyptian took over from it, and we only have Coptic texts. And so there is a problem here, because you have a Coptic syntax, but this is the one text which is somehow strong enough so it breaks through that syntax. And as I say, I speak here with a sort of native informant. The joke always between Bentley Layton and myself. We've been talking to each other about these matters for years. I say that he's a native speaker of Coptic and he's Italian. He said, well, I'm the only native speaker of Gnosis that he knows. Which might be either too much of a compliment or too much of an insult. I always valued him in this regard, because remember a couple of years ago when I was walking downtown in New Haven, here's my fatal digressiveness again, but it does have a point. My shoes were hurting me fearfully as I was horribly overweight at the time and drinking myself to death. And he said, Harold, you don't look well. And I said, my feet hurt. And he said, earnestly, he said, that is because of the archon of shoes. And that is indeed a highly Gnostic remark, but no more. But you have the opening here. He should not say gospel. It's the proclamation or the good news of truth. Is a joy for those who know the call, the Gnostics, who have received from the Father of truth, not the Father of lies, variously called Nastema or Yaldabaoth, but the forefather or foremother, the gift of knowing him. And there is that verb for knowing, always a mutual knowing, because in Gnostic knowing, you and the ultimate divinity know one another simultaneously. One nice way of phrasing that is the rather Heideggerian one of Hans Jonas, who says you can never think of a Gnostic knowing as a concept, as an event in thought, but as a happening, as something dynamic. Now, obviously, there is a kind of Heideggerian dialectic in that, as there usually is in Hans Jonas. In any case, here's this very active or dynamic mutual knowing through the power of the Word, Seth or Christ, that came forth from the pleroma, the original fullness, the 28, as it were, cosmological men and women who, in their unity, made up the forefather and the foremother. The one who is in the thought, Enoia, until it falls, and the mind of the Father, that is the one who is addressed as the Savior, that being the name of the work he is to perform for the redemption of those who were ignorant of the Father, and no Gnostic text ever talks about sin. And that's a very crucial thing to know from the start. It is why, for instance, Emerson is so uninterested in sin, or Whitman, and in a very complex sense, there's no way I can characterize Freud, but it is not un-Gnostic that in Freud too, one would speak not of sin, but of ignorance. What the flaw or the fault is not knowing in Gnosticism. There's no such thing as sin. which is why, by the way, Gnosticism can lead equally, including Valentinian Gnosticism. You'll be delighted to know it's the choice of the individual to either total asceticism or total libertinism, sexually speaking. From a Gnostic perspective, they are absolutely the same. There is no difference between them, because sin is not a category that matters. Only ignorance is. The light for doctrine, of course. Who were ignorant of the Father, while the name of the good news or the proclamation is itself proclamation of hope, being discovery for those who search for him. Now I'm going to slow down and retranslate as I go, and then I'd like some discussion of this paragraph, and then we'll go on to further moments here in this text. Indeed, not the all, but the entirety of the aeons, all of them, got lost. That is to say, and this is a very strange sort of a moment, the Gnostic fall, whether it takes place in Loria, 16th century, 14th centuries after Valentinus, or in this text, comes about in a very curious way. As this text will say a little further on, it was a great wonder that they, the aeons, were already in the Father without knowing him. So they blundered right out of him. The vessels fell right away from him. They had no sense of location. They were blunderers from the start. Indeed, the entirety of the aeons, the all, as it's rendered here, went about searching for the one, forefather or foremother, from whom they, it in the plural, had come forth, and the entirety was already inside of him, and then incomprehensible, inconceivable. Inconceivable is right, incomprehensible isn't. It means the form that is uncontained in anything else, the uncontainable. Not the thing contained, as we would say in English, but that which would always contain the thing contained. Incomprehensible is, I'm assured, by latent mistranslation, and I can well believe that. Not to be conceived, not to be conceptualized, yes, but also the form that cannot be contained by any other form. The entirety was inside of him. He is superior to any cognition. Ignorance, or perhaps it should be translated lack of acquaintance of the Father. And then look at the existential terms here, very strongly emphasized, as you would expect by a Heideggerian influenced philosopher like Jonas, when he talked about this passage. And there is, of course, a strong Gnostic element in Heidegger. One could not deny it for a moment, and Heidegger was not interested in denying it. It may even be that the link, or one of the links, if I may say so, between Heidegger and Lacan is the Gnosticism, which is so deeply contained in each. That category of the Geworfen type, the fact that somehow being, or lack of being, begins with your sense of having already been thrown, which is converted by Lacan to 100 fascinating purposes, is very much a Valentinian Gnostic idea. However, it reached Heidegger, and Heidegger, you must remember, began as a theological student and even as something of an heresiologist. All right, here in the text, ignorance of the Father brought about, and you are very much in the language, I would say more of Lacan perhaps than of Freud, that is to say, this is that fissure that the narcissistic self is invariably involved in, brought about anguish and terror. And the agitation, I'm following latent translation now, which is more literal. I'm substituting words as I go. Not and the anguish grew solid, and the agitation grew dense, like a fog, so that no one was able to see. Now it means, of course, that your inward anxiety, your angst, your dread, so emanates from you that it literally blinds you. For this reason, error became powerful, and this is a female error. This is that form called the Barbello, or the fallen well Sophia. She labored at, and already there is a play here against the J writer. She labored at her own work emptily. The word given here as matter is the adverb emptily. Not it fashioned its own matter foolishly, but she labored emptily at herself in the void. She labored emptily at herself in the void. Gnosticism already at work there. Not having known the truth, it took up residence. Not it set about, but it took up residence in a modeled form. And it obviously was a parody in the original Greek on the Hebrew of modeling a form, which is, of course, the precise Hebrew being used in the second chapter of Genesis. The attack is being made against the J writer and the way Yahweh first made Adam. This is the parody around the true form. This would insist. This is the belated version, which nevertheless tells you the initial truth about the making of Adam. Not Yahweh, but Era, laboring at her own emptiness in the void, out of that emptiness, not out of the abyss, which was not an emptiness, but was the forefather or the foremother. She took up residence in a model form that she was sculpting. Not it said about making a creature. She took up residence in a model form. And with all her power, she prepared this form in beauty as a substitute for the truth. That means then that the primal Adam is the truth, is aletheia, is the undisclosed, to use a Heideggerian term for it, which is again quite close to what this text is doing. But the second Adam is merely beautiful, as though the J writer and his Yahweh were indeed sickening to a false creation, were being merely a sculpture of some kind. But certainly Valentinus is working in very closely to the Hebrew text in his Greek, and one has to restore it from the Coptic. But she has no root, and what has no root cannot be beautified. Being thus without any root is not sufficient for the Coptic there, according to Leighton. Having no root, she herself cannot be beautified. She fell into the fog regarding, and it can be translated either as forefather or foremother. While she was involved in preparing or making the products, including the earthen shapes, and oblivions and terrors, in order that by means of these she might entice those at the midpoint. Now, the middle or those at the midpoint are those who are capable of being saved, who are capable of receiving the Gnostic fall. They are neither those among us who already listen to what is best and oldest in themselves, or those who are gone completely into presumably the normative in either Judaism or Christianity or some mode of paganism, in order that she might entice those at the midpoint into error and separate them from the Father. Here there's just a dash in under the Father. And then, very fascinating, and again I will substitute Leighton's translation, oblivion is not apparent in the Father. Did not come into existence under the Father. Oblivion is not apparent in the Father's company, rather. Oblivion is not apparent in the Father's company, and surely then had no acquaintance or knowledge of him. But what comes into existence in him is acquaintance or knowledge, which appeared in order that forgetfulness, the word is forgetfulness, oblivion has too many Sir Thomas Brownian connotations in English, in order that forgetfulness might vanish and the father or mother might be known. Since forgetfulness came into existence because the father or mother, forefather or foremother, but remember that means the abyss, not God the Father or God the Mother, might be known. Since forgetfulness came into existence because the father or mother was not known, then if the Father comes to be known, no more forgetfulness will exist. Then you have the statement of the doctrine. I want to go a little further on now to the great passage about the jars. Look at the bottom of page 41. And I will not, because it does hold us up, I will not keep using Leighton's, I think, closer translation, but just read what we have here, though I think it is less eloquent. I'm at the bottom of page 41. They kept the same page numbers in the paperback, didn't they? I couldn't believe that they wouldn't. If indeed these things have happened to each of us, then we must see to it above all that the house will be holy and silent for the unity. It is as in the case of some people who moved out of dwellings where there were jars that in spots were not good. Now the question of what these jars contain. whether you want it to contain, say, the wine of life that is never specified, or light, as they do in the Lorianic myth, or as I suspect, texts, good texts rather than bad texts. They would break them, and the master of the house, the true God, the forefather, does not suffer loss. Rather, he is glad because in place of the bad jars there are full ones which are made perfect. For such is the judgment which has come from above. It has passed judgment on every one. It is a drawn sword with two edges. That image, of course, comes directly out of the Gospels, cutting on either side. And then this rather striking passage. When the word came into the midst, the one that is within the heart of those who utter it, which I take it to mean when a jar had in it the true word, Seth, Christ, the true scripture, the gospel of truth, it is not a sound alone, but it became a body. A great disturbance took place among the jars, and it would fascinate me to know whether in some form the Valentinian gospel of truth had been available to Moshe Cordovero, who was the teacher in Spad of Loria, or to Loria himself, because this is already their extraordinary trope. A great disturbance took place among the jars. The Hebrew kalim means vessels in the sense of jars, because some had been emptied, others filled. That is, some had been supplied, others poured out. Some had been purified, still others broken up. And this is exactly the Sheberat HaPelim. All the spaces were shaken and disturbed because they had no order nor stability. Error was upset, not knowing what to do. It was grieved in mourning, afflicting itself because it knew nothing. It is, strictly speaking, an account of catastrophic creation. And then what the gospel does is follow out in terms extraordinarily, I would again say, modern psychological, call them psychoanalytical, call them Freudian or Lacanian, call them Kierkegaardian notions of angst or dread or Heideggerian. Look, for instance, at the extraordinary description of what our lives are like when we are in flight, which I remind you again is the characteristic Freudian trope for what he calls Verdrängung, that kind of pressing under, which is badly translated as repression in English. It is always an estrangement from something, a flight from something, a deviation from something. Here is that extraordinary image of flight in an account of what certainly looks like that kind of repression which produces more than acute neuroses, if not indeed something beyond neuroses, because this is the condition we are in. This is the first full paragraph on page 43. Since it was terror and disturbance and instability and doubt and division, there were many illusions at work by means of these. There were empty fictions, as if they were sunk in sleep and found themselves in disturbing dreams. Either there is a place, and this notion of place, topos, I want to talk about in a moment, to which they are fleeing, as in nightmare, you see, or without strength they come from having chased after others, or they are involved in striking blows, or they are receiving blows themselves, or they have fallen from high places, or they take off into the air, though they do not even have wings. You could be in certain sections of the interpretation of dreams, of the dream book of Freud, of the characteristic mode of anxiety dreams. Again, sometimes it is, and now of course you are in the area that we call paranoia. It is as if people were murdering them, though there is no one even pursuing them, or they themselves are killing their neighbors, for they have been stained with their blood. When those who are going through all these things wake up, and that doesn't just mean from sleep, but because sleep means your characteristic waking state, always to the Gnostics, when they wake up from sleep, they see nothing. They who were in the midst of all these disturbances, for they are nothing. Such is the way of those who have cast ignorance aside from them like sleep, not esteeming it as anything, nor do they esteem its works as solid things either, but they leave them behind like a dream in the night, and then an extraordinary trope, the knowledge of the Father, they value as the dawn. That is to say, when the call comes to you, when you resort to what is best and oldest in yourself, you wake up from that condition, which is as bad in its ordinary waking state as it is when you are in anxiety, nightmares of one sort or another. I want to look at, unfortunately, just one more passage in this, two more passages in this remarkable work, and then see if we can have some discussion. This is becoming too much of a lecture, Tracy, and I regret it, and it won't happen again. The material is unfamiliar to you, I'm sure, at least at the beginning. I want to go back now to the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John and its revision of Eya Asha Eya. Here is the Gospel way of handling the same problem, that is to say, the Gnostic way, the Valentinian way. Top of page 47. Look at the strange attempt to evade iconicism while insisting that there is a true name. First paragraph. Now the name of the Father is the Son. Well, that is, of course, the statement before Abraham was, I am. And there obviously is a reliance on the fourth, almost Gnostic of the Gospels here, and indeed in the Valentinian Church, so far as we know, it was the only part of the New Testament which was preserved and used, and one sees why. It is he who first gave a name to the one who came forth from him, who was himself, and he begot him as a son. And again, he keeps playing with the name, Valentinus. He gave him his name which belonged to him. He is the one to whom belongs all that exists around him, the Father. His is the name, his is the Son. It is possible for him to be seen. Now that's a direct hit against the Gospel of John and its first chapter. No man has seen God. But the name is invisible. God is visible. The forefather or foremother. You can have a vision of the abyss, according to all the Valentinian texts. But the name itself you cannot see, and that raises a very interesting interpretive problem, because it alone is the mystery of the invisible, which comes to ears. The name is auditory, that are completely filled with it. And this funny, dynamic, auditory notion is certainly a normative Jewish legacy, or a Yahwistic Jewish legacy in Valentinus. For indeed the Father's name is not spoken. It is not, after all, spoken in normative Judaism by then, right down to the fall of the temple, except once a year, when it be uttered only by the high priest as he unveiled the Holy of Holies, but it is apparent through a son. And then something very striking. In this way, then, the name is a great thing. Who therefore will be able to utter a name for him, the great name, except him alone to whom the name belongs, and the sons of the name in whom rested the name of the Father? But notice something, this name cannot be Yahweh. That is merely Yahweh, as the next two texts we will look at will tell us. Or even there is a Y-A-W-E who appears there as a child of Yahweh. So it is not the Tetragrammaton, which is the great name. The question is, what is that name? And one last passage about this, bottom of page 47. Therefore he did not receive the name alone as do others, as those who received the name Yahweh did, in the normative tradition, according to the form in which each one is to be produced. But this is the proper name. There is no one else who gave it to him, because this name was never created. This name is as old as the abyss. This name has priority. But he is unnameable, indescribable, until the time when he who is perfect spoke it himself, and it is he who has the power to speak his name and to see it. Then you're told at the top of page 48 that the name can only be uttered when the pleroma is recovered. And it's a rather crucial point to be made here. Valentinianism as against either normative Judaism, which from the time of Ezekiel on talked about individual salvation, the prophetic alternative existing in each man and each woman, each person over 13, or in all forms of early Christianity, or in the other Gnostic sects. But in Valentinianism, nobody could be saved until all those who had the call, all the adepts, all the Gnostics, all those who had acquaintance, could go up and be absorbed into the pleroma all at once. An apocalypse was not therefore envisioned. Something else was envisioned, and that was making the pleroma into a resting place. But then a very beautiful moment which greatly impressed me. I used it to end a not particularly good religious novel that I tried to write about Valentinian Gnosticism. And here the translation doesn't quite get the strength, and I will restore it as it should be. Bottom of page 48. He's talking about the Gnostic callers or seekers. They will be concerned, as the last sentence but one in the last full paragraph on page 48, with those things or whatever entities in which he will find his root and not suffer loss to his soul. And then suddenly the whole quality of it changes, according to Leighton, who knows the Coptic, and you hear a different kind of voice moving. This is the place of the blessed. This is their place. Let the others then know, each in his or her place, that it does not suit me, having been in the place of rest, to speak of anything more. And the rest of it is epilogue, which probably was added by one of the Valentinian disciples. But listen to that again. For the rest then, for the others, may they know, each in his or her place, that it does not suit me, having been in the place of rest, having been in the pleroma, in the fullness, to speak of anything else. Now, it's with that curious ineffable that it trails off. What happens to the doctrine of a name? Or what would seem to be the Gnostic puzzle about naming? I know this is difficult. I know this can sound confusing. And after some discussion, I will take us into two much harsher and coarser books, each rather briefly. First, the one called The Hypostasis, or Reality of the Archons, which is a very grim, parodistic version of Genesis. And then the even more peculiar secret book of John, which parodies more than just Genesis, carries the parody through the parts of the 4 or 5 books. What do you make of that problematic of a name? Why should there be so much Valentinian or so much Gnostic emphasis upon the question of knowing the real name? Which is not what it is supposed to be, and which cannot be written, it can only be heard. You can see the abyss. That is to say, you can have a vision of the pleroma, which after all is still the abyss, or the forefather and the foremother together. You can have been, as Valentinus insists, St. Paul said that he had twice been caught up in the spirit and seen ineffable things. Valentinus says in this text that he has been in the place of rest, and says very graciously, let the others then know, each in his or her place, the topos that they occupy. Those of you who know Hebrew or something about the normative tradition, what does that topos translate? Rather wickedly and antithetically, as I would say, revisionistically, on the part of Valentinus and all Gnostic writers who use it. The strangest and most interesting of all those displaced names of God that the normative rabbis used, as early undoubtedly as the 1st century, was Mahom, in English M-A-K-O-M, the place, as a name for the unpronounceable Yahweh. By the way, to this day we don't know what the true pronunciation. I mean, what did the high priest say in the temple? He might have said Yahweh, he might have said Yahweh. It is disputed among scholars. But Mahom, M-A-K-O-M, the nearest to it in English, meant place in a rather special sense, because the great rabbinical formula for it, as expressed, I think, by Tarfon, but the others say it also, is he, Yahweh, he is the place of the world, but the world is not his place. And that statement is totally unacceptable to the Gnostic or Valentinian doctrine of the pleroma. Why? And now I think we have something to discuss, because this is a subtle, but I think perhaps an absolutely crucial way to seeing a difference between normative Judaism, or for that matter, normative early Christianity, primitive Christianity on the one side, and Gnostic, whether you have Gnostic Christianity as in Valentinus, or that Jewish Gnosis that Sholem worked upon. He is the place of the world, Yahweh, Mahom, because when I call him Yahweh, he is the Mahom. He is the true place of the world, but the world is not his place. It is the same complexity, going back to a Hebraic cast of thought, that McRae misses in his translation when he speaks of incomprehensible, when he should speak rather of that which cannot be contained by any other entity, but is always the containing entity, which is to say what? He is the place of the world, but the world is not his place. Why would that have to be the normative point of view, the prophetic point of view, since the prophetic is perfectly normative, but not quite the apocalyptic point of view, and absolutely not the Gnostic point of view? I repeat it again. He is the Mahom. He is the place of the world, but the world is not his Mahom. It rules out, of course, what Spinoza wanted to do. It rules out pantheism. Absolutely. It is why, in particular, Spinoza, as he rapidly saw, was not philosophically or indeed spiritually speaking a normative Jew. Pantheistic doctrine is utterly excluded by that. Why? He is the place of the world, but the world is not his place. Somebody have a shot at it. Yes.
Well, does that have something to do with his sense of incommensurateness? There seems to be something in this Gnostic vision that one can connect up with that divine, even though there's this kind of radical dualism. There's still a sense that you can connect up with this world, whereas this other vision of Yahweh is that forget it. I mean, it's
you certainly can connect up with it. All you have to do in Gnostic cognition is hear the call, and if you really hear it, you automatically answer it, because in that knowing you are also known, as Jonas has emphasized. And because we see Gnosticism hates time, as it hates history. Gnostic salvation never is a process that takes place in time. You cannot be saved in time. You cannot be instructed in time. It happens in a flash. It happens out of time. What is best and oldest in you hears a call. That call is indeed the sound of its own voice. Therefore, it is hearing ultimately its own true name. They never quite say what that name is, but it must have been a name for the abyss, for that which, as far as they were concerned, the God of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 had stolen everything from. From an original being. Perhaps it was indeed what Heidegger would like to call an original being. Why indeed there should be something and not nothing. This may indeed be, in modern terms, the equivalent of this kind of Valentinian speculation. Mind you, there are more radical speculations. There is Basilides, whom Valentinus probably knew, who was so radically negative that he would not even talk in these terms. But that is another story. That is to say, in the answer to the Leibnizian question that Heidegger likes to ask and answer, why should there be something rather than nothing? Basilides would have shouted out with joy, there's nothing, there's just plain nothing. He's an absolute nihilist. But Gnosticism is not nihilism, any more than Heidegger, of course, is nihilism. And go on a little further with this.
Well, and it seems like this more normative sense is that there is no way to, maybe it's a sense of fact history or whatever, that Yahweh is in a wholly other realm, and there's just no way you can bridge that.
All right, but let me gloss what you're saying. No Valentinian Gnostic, let's say Valentinus himself, the almost certain author of this lovely text, Valentinus would never have disputed the second half of that statement. But the world is not his place. Any Gnostic could have cheerfully admitted that. What would have upset them more than greatly, what they could not accept, is the statement, He, Yahweh, is the place of the world. What they had to deny was the doctrine, indeed, of the Malchon as a name. Now why? Why? Why are you forced to say that He, God, is not the place of the world? Obviously, if you are normative, you add that the world is not his place. Eya asha eya. He will go into it when he wants to. He will depart into it. He will arrive in history. He will leave in history. But it is very normative, Christian and Jewish, to say he is the place of the world. It becomes a terrifying statement, alas, if you are a rabbi in Auschwitz, and yet there were rabbis in Auschwitz who could still say that he is the place of the world. But no Gnostic would ever be willing to say that in any place whatsoever.
Well, again, maybe it has to do with also being part of creation, which has nothing to do with
Okay. And then it goes on.
A demiurgic.
Any notion of a place, if it is not the original place, if it is not the pleroma or original fullness, is simply part of what Valentinus and all the other Gnostics call the kenoma, Kenoma in English, the emptiness, the cosmological spaces, the abyss, not the true abyss, but the abyss referred to by Christians and Jews, whereinto we have been thrown. You know, the great Valentinian formula, which I remember quoting in many places, but which is not here in one of the Hammadi texts, was the little poem that Valentinus wrote, which is quoted by one of his disciples, Theodotus, to explain why he refused the sacraments. What makes us free is the Gnosis. What makes us free is the acquaintance or the knowledge. And making us free means we don't need the sacrament. Of who we were, of what we have become, of wherein we were, of whereto we have been thrown, of what birth really is, of what rebirth really is. That is a kind of Valentinian credo, and it's totally loaded, and it totally disqualifies either normative Judaism or normative Christianity. What makes us free is the knowledge of who we were. We were the forefather and the foremother, and we still have the pluma or spark of that in us, even though the jars broke. Where we were in the pleroma. Where were we thrown? Into this cosmological emptiness that the priestly author calls the cosmos, or that even Paul is willing to call the cosmos. Wherefore, whereto are we journeying? I left that out. We are journeying back to the pleroma once we hear the call. Well, that's fine. Now, what about the whole question of the name? Why in the Gospel of Truth does Valentinus play so endlessly with this notion of the name? Give you this sort of extraordinary poetic play upon it, which takes up, I would think, about 1/3 of his text, and is the most difficult thing in his text. And the thing to compare here is indeed the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John, and the way it distinguishes itself from what it called Moses. God will not say to Moses, in that Elohistic redaction of the J writer, who he is. Moses says, by what name shall I tell my fellow Jews who sent me? The reply is, tell them that Eya Asha Eya sent you. Moses does not know what to make of that, but nevertheless he is forced to accept it. It is not a name. It is a punning play, testifying, as I said before, to that endless verbal play in which the J writer is adept, but which the Elohist nowhere shows an ability to indulge in. So he has done something to the text. But you know, though this will sound like a digression, it isn't, because in a moment I want to take us out of the speculation on the name, but we can give it a little more time, and should. You will think, indeed, I spend my nights doing odd things, but I've been ill, not that odd, these last 4 days and nights. And I read for the first time in many years that work which is called alternately, it's one of these pseudographia, it's not the Apocrypha. It's called alternately the Little Genesis or the Book of Jubilees. A Jubilee being, as you know, 7 times 7 years, 49 years. It is the high point of Pharisaic or normative Judaism. It was written, according to all the scholars, we can just about fix the date. The year must be about the year 105 to 109 BC, or before the Common Era. The Maccabeans have triumphed. The third of the Maccabees, Simon the Maccabee, brother of Judas and Jonathan, has been simultaneously high priest, prophet, and king, and it is handed on to his son, an even more remarkable man, Yohanan Perikonos, as he was called, John Perikonos, who became a Pharisee, and who broke with the Pharisees sometime between 105 and 109. It is at that point, but before he breaks with the Pharisees, that the so-called Little Genesis, it's 4 times the length of Genesis, it's called Little Genesis, because it fills in all the details, is written. I read it again last night with the utmost fascination. We don't have the original Hebrew. It must have been written in Hebrew. We have only a Greek version, and we have a Latin version, and there's an Ethiopic version, which I can't read. There's a good standard translation by R.H. Charles. I looked at the Greek version, and I looked at Charles. fascinating thing about the text, and I've never realized this before. You really see what the normative tradition by 100 years before Christ, which means 170 years before the destruction of the temple, you see, and also, of course, 170 years before the coming on of the full normative Judaism, directly descended from the Pharisees that we know in the Tanam and the Amorim, the men who write Pirkei Avot, and the Mishnah of Judah the Prince, the great men, Akiva, Gamaliel, Hillel, Shammai, Ishmael, Tarfon. Those we think of most as meaning what we mean by rabbinical Judaism. But just a few generations before this, their direct ancestors are the first Pharisees who triumphed under John Hyrcanus. Everything in Genesis and Exodus, which had been that the J writer originally wrote, which was still problematic or difficult, but which had been left there in some form by the Elohistic, priestly, and Deuteronomistic redactors, vanishes completely. There's nothing. It's as though J had never existed. And I invite you to look at that book, Jubilees. Jacob never wrestles with an angel. It never happens. Jacob is not wrestling in the womb with his brother, and does not have a name mean heel, and does not come out grasping the brother's heel. Jacob, in fact, eventually fights a battle with all his group against Edom and Esau, and wins the victory. The Akedah, or sacrifice of Isaac, has nothing to do with Yahweh. Mastema, the Satan figure, who's in the court of God but already lurching outside it, comes down and imposes it, and then Yahweh intervenes to stop it. Mastema then shows up in Egypt, and en route to Egypt, Mastema attempts to murder Moses, of course. Then he shows up in Egypt and hardens the Pharaoh's heart, and so on and so on. Every single problematic element, every uncanny, the Tower of Babel story is gone. Every single thing that in our 3 weeks, pretty much, that we spent, or 2.5 weeks, talking about the J writer, is completely gone from the Pharisaic text called the Little Genesis or Jubilees. It's almost as though the writer, who is a particular writer, there's no doubt about it, we're dealing with a very strong style. It's not a good literary style, but a good strong style. That writer set out to say, look, there are disturbing elements here, and everything left undone by E, P, and D, that Pharisee writing about the year 109 to 105 before the Common Era finishes off. And there's no J left whatsoever in Genesis, Exodus, or Numbers. It's a fascinating confirmation, it seems to me, of the kind of talking about what was unheimlich or uncanny about J that I've been talking about. I want to bring it up because the strange thing, and I think this relates to what we're talking about now, it relates to the problem of the name also. As far as I can tell, both the normative and the esoteric cannot stand J. And you can see, and we've already seen to some extent, that if you read the book of Jubilees, you would see the end product. You will see how the normative got rid of J. Yet it is J, oddly enough, rather than the normative, which most offends. Because I think they recognize his power, his spiritual and literary and uncanny power, who most offends Gnostic writers. And I think that this playing with the question of this name, and this playing with the question of the place, is indeed a attempt at getting back at J. But I want to take us to another text in the time we have left. Look at the hypostasis or reality of the archon. Hypostasis means reality there. I want to look at two passages. One is on page 152 to 153. Bear with me. We still have some time today. The title, of course, means, by the way, this translation you can trust because it's the one translation in this book already done by my friend Bentley Layton. So it's a very powerful translation, though he said to me very sadly, he's afraid his translation is better than the original. Since this is true. But since this is true, alas, the King James or authorized version of the New Testament, I assure you. I mean, St. Paul is a strong writer, but not as good a writer as Miles Coverdale and Tyndale, who translate them so powerfully. And this is certainly true. The revelation of St. John the Divine in the original is, I assure you, from a literary point of view, ghastly. a more illiterate mixture, and I'm not the first person to say this, I'm not being eccentric, a more illiterate mixture of Aramaic syntax and Greek diction could not be imagined. Whoever wrote that work had a lot less grasp of Greek than certainly the author of the fourth Gospel. But of course, in the King James Testament, it's immensely powerful, because first you have the great Tyndale, who's one of the great masters of English prose writing, and then you have he was the one burned at the stake, of course. But then you have the great Miles Coverdale, who, I mean, I would think that short of Shakespeare, the greatest of all Elizabethan writers is Miles Coverdale, because most of the language that we have, though he's building on Tyndale's base, and just as Tyndale built on the Wycliffe Bible, but most of the actual language, most of the great phrases, most of that extraordinary roll and rhythm that we have in the authorized or King James Version is the work of Miles Coverdale. In any case, here we are in that work called The Reality of the Authorities, or The Reality of the Evil Angels, or the Bad Rulers. And we take ourselves on page 153, the blind chief, Strmel, or the devil, cries out, "It is I who am God, there is none apart from me." That is, as you undoubtedly recognize, a familiar Gnostic parody of a particular text in the prophet Isaiah. But then you get, and this is the first instance we have of it, and I want us to talk about this because it is always this contrast between the mirror stage, the mirror phase, and I do adapt that from Lacan, of a kind of primal narcissism, as being, and I know this is going to sound crazy, there are two false creations, according to the Gnostics. There's the actual creation as it took place. That's the false creation. It shouldn't have been, but that's how it actually happened. There's the actual false creation, and then there's the false creation that the J writer and the priestly writer, that didn't even happen. And look at this contrast right here, quite beautifully and strikingly contrasted on page 153. First you have what happened to the Barbello or Sophia figure, originally named Incorruptibility. As she looked down into the region of the waters, I'm about halfway down page 153, her image appeared in the waters, and the authorities of the darkness, the archons, became enamored of her. But they could not lay hold of that image which had appeared to them in the waters because of their weakness, since beings that merely possess a soul, and this is a very important moment, to have a soul is just as bad as having a body, according to the Gnostics. We are tripartite beings in all Gnosticism, including the Valentinian. We have a pneuma or spark, and that's what matters, because that's that bit of the original abyss. Then we have the mere soul that has been placed in us, as we have the mere body that's been hacked out for us. That soul and that body we can equally do without, you see. Hence, indeed, you can get those extremes of libertinism and ascesis. But to go on with this, because of their weakness, since beings that merely possess a soul cannot lay hold of those that possess a spirit, and spirit means pneuma, spark, for they were from below while it was from above. This is the reason why Incorruptibility looked down into the region, so that by the Father's will she might bring the entirety into union with the light. But the archons, and now you're going to move to the text of J, very shrewdly laid plans and said, "Come, let us create a man that will be soiled from the earth." By the way, I left this out, and that's the thing that shocks me most about Jubilees. The creation scene in Jubilees is chapter 1 of Genesis. Almost all of chapter 2 of Genesis is gone, and though you wouldn't think it's possible that Pharisaic rabbi, no doubt the height of orthodoxy in his century, and at this point I found myself growing indignant. I am so attached to Jay, and to that great moment, Yahweh does not put his hand down into the Palestinian earth in the hard spring, get that handful of red clay, mold it, and breathe upon it. It's not there at all. It never happened. Here it happened, but it didn't happen, as it were. They took some soil from the earth. That is to say, the moment in J, abandoned in Jubilees, is always the moment most hated by the Gnostics, and I want to ask why, and get it back in discussion to where we were. They took some soil from the earth and modeled their man after their body and after the image of God that had appeared to them in the waters. That's a very subtle moment. Somebody expound that to me. That is to say, that Yahwistic moment, that J moment of modeling our shape in the Tselem, in the image of God, was only done after the body of the archons, themselves already part of the misshapen creation, or a narcissistic or reflected or mirror image of God, which means that they had to get it even more wrong than they would have had to get it. They said, "Come, let us lay hold of it by means of the form that we have modeled, so that we may see its male counterpart, and we may seize it with the form that we have modeled, not understanding the force of God because of their powerlessness." And then you get a byplay about Adam and the name and the sleep of ignorance, and a parody of the J creation of woman being created by the side. And you get that very bitter repetition of the form that they had modeled together with their own image, making them liable to condemnation, still being as anti-J as possible, on the top of page 155. And then, because I would like to then use our remaining time today, before I run for LaGuardia, in a discussion of some of this, I'd like us to look at certain moments in the text of the secret book of John, the Apocryphon of John. This starts on pages 104 to 105. By the way, if I feel too frustrated that we haven't gotten far enough today, I will ask you next time. In fact, let me ask you now anyway, before we go into the next 10 or 15 minutes of discussion. Next time, bring and have read the Freud, but bring the Nod Hammadi text back with you also, so we can spend some more time on this. One has the image of the Barbello on top of page 104, wishing to bring forth a likeness of herself without the consent of the pneuma. Now that image of a false creation goes right on through the book. And what, of course, is being parodied? For instance, what in J is being clearly parodied in the first full paragraph on page 106? But I said, "Lord, what does it mean that she moved to and fro?" And he smiled and said, "Do not think it is, as Moses said, above the waters." That is to say, what particular part of the J text is also being found offensive there to the Gnostic sensibility? And why? Well, you remember the text. And the Ruach, the breath of the Yahweh Elohim, moved across or over or upon, it's hard to translate the Hebrew, the face of the waters of the Tohu Bohu, of that vast emptiness, and out of it grew forth first the firmament, and then the different stages of the creation. Why is that trope? And it is, of course, metaphor or trope. Why is that even more offensive to a Gnostic, or as offensive to a Gnostic sensibility, as the modeling of the house of our bodies out of the earth, out of the clay? One way of talking about this is to talk about a Gnostic text, which is not to be found here. It's in the strange Gnostic text called the Acts of the Apostle Thomas. It's the extraordinary prose chant about which Jonas writes very beautifully, traditionally called the Hymn of the Pearl. And it will remind you in some ways of its final trope of Mr. Eliot's famous garlic and sapphires in the mud, which is a kind of Gnostic trope. So what the garlic is doing in there, I'm not quite sure. Because the notion is that pneuma, or spark, or spirit, is a pearl buried not just in mud, but in defecation. That the earth is indeed so much cosmological defecation, according to this Gnostic vision, and the pneuma, or spark, is buried in it. One sees, therefore, the terrible offensiveness of the J passage, in which, as it were, the defecatory matter from the Gnostic point of view is picked up by the demiurge, who does not even blow into it a true spark or pneuma, but a mere ruach or soul, making it doubly damned or cursed, and a double insult to the image of the human as far as they are concerned. Similarly, with the movement of a ruach, a mere soul, over the face of the waters, they are doubly offended. First, because it is not pneuma, or pearl, or spark, but merely the breath of the demiurge. Secondly, because those waters which are being denigrated and forced to turn into firmament, they are the true abyss. They are the true pleroma. They are the undivided foremother and forefather, which is to be violated. I want to look at literally just one more moment in this text. Ark, because the bitterness even toward Jays and the Elohistic story of the Ark goes right through also. And then let us take our remaining time for some discussion. Bottom of page 114. The demiurge, the archon figure, decided to bring a flood over the whole work of man. But the greatness of the light of the foreknowledge, that is to say, still the redemptive portion, the call, informed Noah, and he proclaimed it to the offspring which are the sons of men. But those who were strangers to him did not listen to him. It is not as Moses said. And that phrase occurs again and again in this book, in the hypostasis of the archons, in Gnostic text after text, the bitterness. It is not as Moses said. Let me ask you this question, and as I say, I'll ask you to bring this text as well as the Freud next time. What is the difference between saying, before Abraham was I am, meaning also, as I would say, before Moses was I am, or, as the first chapter of the Gospel of John says, the law, the Torah, was given by Moses, but Charis and Aletheia, grace and truth, came by Christ. What is the difference between that mode of protest against Moses, including troping against him, as in before Abraham was I am, and the much more bitter, much more vindictive, nothing moved over the face of the waters, nothing was fashioned or modeled, it was not as Moses said? What's the difference between the two attitudes? If I can hear something on that, then I will part not unhappy today. I don't feel like flying out to Detroit. Yes.
Well, it just seems to me when I was reading before that in the John Gospel, he allows Moses to have given the law, whereas Christ gives grace and whatever. Here, seems to be denying Moses.
All right, and that is a real difference. And that does indeed show why, in spite of Marcion and certain other early Christian Gnostics who wished to repudiate the so-called Old Testament or the Hebrew Scripture completely, it was kept in the canon as far as the church was concerned. But what about the subtler matter, which interests me more? What is the difference between saying, before Abraham was I am, meaning by that, as I would say transsumptively, before Moses was I am, and before the Moses or J writer or whatever was I, the man writing this gospel, am? What is the difference between that and saying nothing moved over the waters, nothing was fashioned out of the clay or indeed out of the defecation, because that's all clay is, that's all the kenoma or cosmological emptiness really is. Moses lied. It was not as Moses said. What is the difference? And it is a subtle and real difference, but not a total difference. Is it a difference in degree or in kind? That is to say, there clearly is a difference in kind with what you've just said, my dear. Is it another difference in kind between the Johannine protest, subtle as it is, more powerful as it is, I think, and the Gnostic protest, or is it a difference just in degree? Because turning on that would turn the whole question of whether or not Johannine Christianity is not, after all, fundamentally more Gnostic than it was willing to acknowledge, at least in the version that we have. Now that is a subtle question, I grant you, but is that more a difference in degree or in kind? Between saying, how can you have seen Abraham? You're not even 50 years old. We're children of Abraham. How can you set us free? We are free, being children of Abraham. And he's saying, no, you're children of the devil, and I'm not even a child of Abraham. Before Abraham was, past tense, I am, Eya. And that indeed reminds you that I am he who could say, if I wanted to, Eya, Asha, Eya. Is that a difference in kind, or is it a remarkable difference in degree? Because are you not also then saying that in some sense Moses did not say this? Moses left something out? And it isn't simply a question that in the fullness of time the later text will redeem or fulfill the earlier text? Is it a difference between being a fulfiller of signs and somebody saying that the signs were wrongly inscribed in the first place? Or when you are talking that much as a fulfiller of signs, are you not implying strongly that they were inscribed wrongly in the first place? It may be an unanswerable question, but I think it's a very important one, because on the whole question of just what the relation to Gnosticism of Johannine Christianity as a particular variety of Christianity is. And after all, if normative Christianity has more of a Gnostic element in it than it's prepared to admit, then there are a great many complexities which would flow from this. Certainly Freud would have believed that normative or Orthodox Catholicism in the Vienna of his day was essentially a Gnosticism, though he never says so. What would you like to say?
Well, I was going to say, well, it seems like that's part of what Luther was attacking.
Yes. Then one enters into the whole question of just what radical Protestantism is up to, and whether or not it is not trying to clear away the Johannine element in a rather Augustinian kind of a way, perhaps. In any case, my dears, forgive me. I am going to make an end run for LaGuardia and then for the Detroit airport, but I will never do this again, I promise. I think it disconcerts the class. I just couldn't help it. We meet at the regular time, 4 o'clock next week, and I urge those of you who are free then come see me between 2:30 and 4, if you haven't come to talk about essays as yet. And remember, bring the 2 Freudian volumes and have read the right things in them, and bring this again.